Okay, hello, Julie. Nice to see you. Welcome, and
Thanks for having me.
thank you for joining me today. Um, thank you for your piece, which is titled "Sheltered in Place: Violence Against Women in Lockdown." It's such a good read. I just reread it again this morning. So the first question is very simple. Why did you write this piece? What was it that was driving you to write this, and what is it that was motivating the piece?
Well, I've been doing work to end violence against women in Canada for almost 20 years,
Wow.
and I'm also a survivor of intimate partner violence. And ironically, my memoir, Resilience is Futile, which is about my experience of intimate partner violence and stalking, my memoir dropped the day the pandemic was declared.
Oh my, yes, I
Um,
recall, and I do remember reading your manuscript. It's an excellent book.
oh,
And
thank you.
my apologies that we couldn't properly launch your book.
Yeah, so it was a really weird time where I was already thinking a great deal about
Yeah.
violence against women because of my book writing, and
Yes.
then to have it launched the day of the pandemic really brought into focus the issues for me. And so when Between the Lines said they were putting together this collection, right away I wanted to create space to talk about violence
Hmm.
against women and how the pandemic, and particularly the lockdown, has really exacerbated a long-standing problem.
Yeah, I noticed that in your, in the introduction, especially your mention of the Dalhousie dentistry issue, the Me Too movement, the inquiry on missing Indigenous women, all the examples you gave suggest that, this has been a long-standing issue. You're saying you've been working on it for 20 years. Obviously, it's an issue that predates that work. It seems like a perennial issue in that sense. And in that sense, I'm thinking of skipping back to in a way to your conclusion where you say we're all exhausted, and maybe we're all a bit exhausted by trying to point out violence against women, or finding solutions for it, and yet at the same time we can't give up. And I'm wondering if you can maybe expand on that, or comment on that struggle. Um,
Yeah, well, what's interesting is the collection came out before the murder of George Floyd,
yes.
and before Canada's deadliest shooting in PostPandemic, Nova Scotia,
Yes. Yes.
um, which I think has really highlighted the issue of violence against women. And so it's really interesting that even prior to these two big moments, um, we were already feeling exhausted in
Hmm.
trying to galvanize people. We were already feeling like our resources were stretched to the max.
Hmm.
And so to me, yeah, we're in this really interesting moment that I tried to capture in the book, where on the one hand, people
Hmm.
have lots of time
Yes.
to learn about social justice issues. And you've seen with the revival of focus on Black Lives Matter, for example, that white folks are, reading works by folks of color and trying to get educated on anti-racism.
Hmm.
So on the one hand, it's like there's people are hungry to learn about new things, but
Yes.
it's like we can never um, really maintain that momentum because something else will come along. And we've seen that with violence against women, where we've done so much work in Canada from, like literally decades
Hmm.
ago to, what happened in Montreal in '89, which really kind of galvanized the women's movement in Canada, to the van attack in Toronto, to what
Hmm.
happened in PostPandemic. Like, it's just like there's no shortage of examples of reasons why we need to care about this. And
Hmm.
yet people who are outside the movement oftentimes are in deep denial about what's happening,
Hmm.
or in my experience as a Canadian doing this work, are very quick to point out how it's worse elsewhere.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing that right now in the context of so many issues, whether you're talking about, police brutality, or even just the impact of COVID. People are
Yes.
just so quick to say,
Yeah.
well, in the States, it's like, okay, but I'm not talking about,
Yeah.
what's going on in the US. I'm talking about here. And Canadians are very reticent to face their own atrocities.
Yeah. And I guess also not just our own atrocities, but really I think you point out the kind of long-standing problem with violence against women. I think the example I'm thinking of is shelters, like that we've needed shelters long before we ever had shelters. So we have shelters now, but there's this thirst, or this desire to go back to normal, And so I think in your chapter you suggest, well, go back to what kind of normal, right? We don't want to go back to 2019
Yeah,
because that's just, it'll be more of the same. And so if we go backwards, back to normal, does that mean we would just perpetuate a situation where we just constantly need more shelters?
exactly.
Or to, I guess what I'm trying to say is, it seems as if the problem, the problem of violence against women gives rise to the need for shelters. So how do you address the problem of violence against women? Not so much that we just need more shelters, because to build more shelters would be to go back to 2019, to just, right? So I'm
Yeah.
wondering, is it possible actually in that sense? I mean, that's a kind of a big question. Is it possible to end violence against
Yes,
women?
it is. And that is like, that is the biggest message that I have to do every day in my work, is like,
Yes.
the most controversial part of the work I do is when I tell people that we can prevent violence against women. Like,
Mm-hmm.
the vast majority of violence against women can be prevented, whether you're talking about
Mm-hmm.
sexual assault or domestic violence or
Yeah.
workplace sexual harassment. We have plenty of evidence that we can do the front end prevention piece and not
Mm-hmm.
do, as you said, we need more shelters, absolutely. But
Yes.
again, as you said, that woman's already been harmed,
Yeah.
you know? And so my frustration has always been around the kind of elephant in the room, which is,
Yeah.
I work in a sector of people who largely are not invested in prevention. And I think it's because deep down they believe that we can't really do anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a defeatist attitude. It's also not based in truth. And so for me, it's important for us to think about, what does prevention look like? And frankly, the complexity of prevention in our current climate, where students are not in school.
Yes.
And, you know, so for so long I've been on, you know, me and my colleagues are on the path of, we need consent education in schools. We need healthy
Yeah.
relationship education. Like, that's how we're going to prevent this problem. And now it's like, okay, well, they're not in school. So what does prevention look like under lockdown? How do you have conversations about family violence when everyone's stuck at home with their family? You know, how do you even fundraise for shelters or advocacy work when everyone's broke and no one knows what the future holds? Like, I just think it's a lot of work, but fundamentally people need to buy into the idea that violence can be prevented. And until we do that, we're going to see such a huge focus on, well, we just need more money for the legal system, and we need to train police. And I'm like, that's part of it, but like, you're obscuring the to me, the biggest piece of the puzzle, which is, let's stop it from happening in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I was actually quite struck by your introduction. I mean, the honesty of it as well, and then of your survival and your escape from being with your partner. And I guess the part that was struck me also, not just the honesty of that, but also what you say, where you said it's really the community that helped me escape, because the police were of no help to me. My employer was of no help to me. My school was of no help to me. And so I thought that was quite interesting, because these institutions are often the institutions we turn to as, if you will, leaders or people, you know, with mechanisms or policies in place to help us. So if indeed we turn to community, friends, networks, family, and we can't do that now because of the so-called physical or social distancing, what do you envision is a possible way forward, you know, during the pandemic and also post, in terms of this? Because you're saying community is this most important thing, and yet we don't have it now. And in fact, community saved my life, and now we really don't have it. So I'm wondering if you can just kind of expand on that, or comment on that.
Yeah, certainly. I think I think community still exists in many
Mm-hmm.
ways, but I think we have to re-envision how we connect to community, how we tap into community. And this focus on social media, for example, you know, we're doing everything online.
Mm-hmm.
Fostering connection online is difficult to do in many ways, but even when you do know the person,
Yes.
you know, prior to being online, it still can be really difficult to check in with people and to really pick up on maybe subtle cues, because
Mm-hmm.
we're all acting out of character right now in many
Yes.
ways, right?
Yeah.
And so cues that people picked up on prior to telling me you need to leave him, for example, were things like, you know, you look a little dull, like you don't have your joie de vivre that you usually do, what's going on.
Yes.
Isolating myself, for example, things that now we're encouraging people to do.
Yeah.
And so the cues that people would pick up on of like, oh, Julie's usually really extroverted and doing that. Maybe she's not that way right now because she lost her job because of COVID and not because, you know, like it's just so much harder to pick up. So we have to be explicit. And one that can be difficult if someone's not in a position to be able to be honest because they're living with an abuser. But also I think because culturally in Canada, especially white Canada, we're not socialized to check in with people. We're told to, you know, mind your own business and let people live. And so I think we really need to push ourselves to just be more explicit in saying like, hey, Julie, like, how's it going? Like, how are you actually doing? And to be open to hearing, actually, things are not doing super well. And to being receptive to hearing that. And I think we just need to pivot the way we think about building community and assume that it can't really happen organically in our current climate. So we have to be intentional about it and be intentional about checking in with people, which oftentimes we don't do because of our own socialization of politeness or I don't want to open up a can of worms or I'm not the best person. I'm here today because fellow 20-year-old women showed up for me when I was, and so you don't need a PhD in psychology to show up for somebody, right? And that's but we have to be intentional about it right now, which is new for us, frankly.
But I guess that also, it points out that I think what you're saying also is don't rely on institutions, rely on community. And then we have to pivot or shift the way in which we imagine community today, because it's a little bit different with screens and with distancing. But that can be overcome and community can still exist. So do you hold any hope for institutions though? You know, like police, like your employer, or like schools, or whatever institutions, or healthcare, or you know, do you hold any hope for them in terms of being agents of change, agents that will help speed the end to violence against women? Or is it that you only hold hope for what I think you described in the introduction, community?
It depends on the institution. So I have very little faith in the legal system when it comes to violence against women. They don't have a track record that impresses me. So same thing with police, but I have, you know, I think again, it's context specific. I've worked in rural communities where, you know, the small nursing station ends up being a community hub where people get mental health support and sexual violence support. So like in those spaces, yes. But I think broader institutions still have a lot of work to do. And again, I think right now we're focusing a lot on the police, which I'm here for. But I think it's naive to assume that these other institutions are also utopias when we know that education systems continue to be sexist and racist and transphobic, that they're not, you know, hospitals are not trauma informed. Mental health services are often not trauma informed or intersectional. So I fundamentally have to be hopeful because the very nature of my job is waking up every day and believing that we can end violence against women. So hope is embedded in everything I do. But for me, there's a reason why I focus on by-center intervention, community accountability, because those are the places where I've seen the most progress and where I have the most hope, frankly. But I've always been of the mind that, you know, when police have asked me to come and talk about stalking, that I'll go and do it. When nurses want to know, how do I do trauma-informed check-ins? I'm there for it. But personally, I can't justify spending 100% of my energy on institutions. Because they're just not showing up and they're not meeting us halfway.
And so do you foresee post-pandemic, if there is such a thing, post-pandemic, I shouldn't be so negative, but post-pandemic, do you foresee that institutions will change? Because I think some authors in this, especially in this collection, have suggested, well, now nothing is normal. You know, the oil and gas sector is kind of imploded. There's no way we can just go back to normal. Institutions will have to change. The private sector will have to change. Police, the government, municipal services, they'll have to change. Do you have that kind of a sense of the future post-pandemic, or do you have a different sense?
I would say prior to the uprising of BLML
Mhm.
over the last few weeks and months, I
Yes.
would have said no.
Oh, okay.
But to see
Yes.
mainstream media coverage of the very idea of defunding police, to see someone like Robin Maynard, who's been so
Sure.
brilliant and articulate on mainstream CTV, talking
Yes.
to white people about
Yeah.
how we can defund police, and that actually getting some head nods,
Yes.
that's been a game changer for me, frankly. Like,
Hmm.
I'm seeing that our ideas, when we have a tiny glimpse, like a tiny moment where we can
Yes.
share our ideas with the
Yeah.
mainstream, they become palpable for people.
Hmm.
And so I am feeling more and more hopeful about institutional change post-pandemic, because as you said, everything has been thrown up in the air, and I
Hmm.
almost feel like there's like a mood shift where people are kind of like, why can't we rethink things? Because we have to rethink the 9 to 5, and we have to
Hmm.
rethink what childcare looks like, and why not think about police or hospitals or whatever. So there seems to be an appetite for shaking things up, and that's always conducive to systemic change. And I think the movement and the work, like I said, that Black Lives Matters
Hmm.
um, organizers have done over the last few weeks has shown us
Hmm.
that, like, you can question these big institutions that for a long time were just untouchable.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
So,
that's super encouraging to me.
yeah, another world is possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just an aspiration. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, just as the last question, Julie, um, is there anything that you would write differently now that, I mean, because we, I think, asked for the submissions in April, we published in May. So, it's been a few months, 3 months, let's say, since you wrote it, and a lot has changed since then. Is there anything that you would change or put in or alter, or would you write something completely different now? Like, just curious.
I think the biggest change for me would be those two pieces around what happened in Pacific,
Oh, I see.
and
Yeah. Hmm.
like what happened in Nova Scotia, and
Yeah.
the fact that my colleagues and I right away had just a feeling that misogyny was involved,
Yes.
and the fact that that was proven correct,
Yeah.
is quite, and the fact that now we're not, we're fighting to even get a public
Yeah.
inquiry.
Is
So
correct me if I'm wrong, but did he murder his partner first? Was that the first?
he
Yeah.
no, so thankfully she survived. I
Oh
mean,
no, that's right. That's
yeah,
attempted.
she,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
she
Yeah.
was able to escape, and then when she escaped into the woods,
I
that's when he
recall
began
now.
his
Yeah.
rampage. Yeah. And now, just a few days ago, more information came out as a result of access to information that people in the community said he was a sexual predator. I mean, just like
Yes.
really heinous stuff has come out. But I think
Hmm.
just the very fact that it happened, it was so predictable in so many ways, even though it was such at the extreme end of the continuum.
Sure. Oh yeah.
I don't think there's a feminist in this country that was surprised that our deadliest shooting was, motivated by misogyny. So I
Hmm.
think that piece kind of drives home the article. But I think the
Hmm.
biggest change I would make if I rewrote it today was that believe that systemic change is possible, because look at how we're talking about the police now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it is, I come from working class, very poor white people in a small parts of Canada,
Hmm.
and they're talking about defunding the police.
Wow.
And the idea that, like, how
Okay.
would that even happen? But the fact,
Yeah.
even if they're asking it with like sort of an
Yeah.
incredulous way, they're asking the question.
Sure.
They're forced to think about it. And that wasn't because their,
Hmm.
family member who's like got educated came back and told them how to live. It's because it's on the news.
Yes. Yeah.
And that is, I mean, I don't think we can underestimate how powerful that is, that conversation, what we've seen is so fringe for so
Hmm.
long, is now a mainstream topic of debate. That's progress. And I think we should see it as such, for sure.
Great. Well, that's great talking to you, Julie. Thank you so much for your chapter, and for your thoughts, and also for the honesty in the chapter. It was quite a good read, and quite
Thank
a
you.
eye-opening read. So thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, okay. Just